Hello and welcome to another episode of this season of Try This on Wisp Sports. I'm your host, Dr. Kirstin Lauritzen, and today we are going to talk about a topic that is very important to me. It's one that I work with a lot in my practice, and it's also one that is a very interesting topic for athletes. So we're talking about something called the mitochondria today. It's becoming a much more talked about topic. I would say we're starting to see a lot more research on the mitochondria and specifically how that relates to energy and then also sports performance. And so today, if you heard the word mitochondria and you're like, okay, I don't know if I'm in for this. I really hope that you stick with me because the mitochondria are your energy creators. They are what helps you with being able to get oxygen to your tissues and even more efficiently if you can have a very good functioning system. They also are part of what makes it so that you have better performance. You have more of a resistance to fatigue and an ability to maintain speed. I think, especially in the context of endurance sports, particularly, but with any sport, this is it is your mitochondria that are part of what helps you be able to get to the end of that race, still feeling like you're doing really well, right? Like you're not seeing that drop in pace. You're still feeling pretty strong. You're not, really feeling a whole ton of that fatigue. They play a huge role in that. And the other reason why the mitochondria are so critical is because not only do they influence your entire energy system, but they also play quite a role when you think of how they're working with nutrient deficiencies and nutrition and stuff like that. So we're gonna dive into that today. So as I mentioned already, some of the reasons why we want to have really healthy mitochondria is because they really do help your cells be able to absorb and use oxygen well. They are part of what creates energy. They create something called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And they basically take your fuel sources, right? So protein, carbs, fats, and they are the ones that so you absorb all of that through your gut, and then those get into your cells, and that's what your body uses in order to create energy. So the mitochondria help you do all of that. And there's a series of processes that they go through in order to make that happen. But part of all of that is if you want to be able to use your fueling efficiently, we also need to make sure that your mitochondria are doing really well. They also have an influence on your performance. So if you work on your mitochondria and make sure that they are happy and healthy, we can actually see better performance down the line. They also help with that resistance to fatigue and also are a really big piece of helping you to maintain speed. So, and here's the thing too of why I felt like this was a really good topic for today is because we've talked about a lot of different systems in the body. We've talked about the gut. We've talked about the role that nutrients play. We've talked about a lot of different things on this podcast, but the mitochondria, and I know that I've referenced the mitochondria in the past, but this I felt like was a really good episode to do because it's part of what makes an athlete an athlete. There's a study I think it potentially is decades old now, but they were looking at the density of mitochondria in your high performing athletes. I'm talking, anybody that's considered an elite or pro athlete. They did a study and they looked at the density of the mitochondria in their tissues. And what they found is that especially in those elite athletes, they had a much higher density of mitochondria per cell in their muscle than your kind of average person. And then what they looked at is how that happens. And part of why we train and part of why we do what we do is to try to that's one of the physiological things that's happening inside the body when you train is you're working on building up mitochondria, you're working on making some of those cellular changes so that you can be more efficient and more effective and faster. So I think that's a really cool thing. But here's the other piece of really why I wanted to talk about this today is because a lot of the times, and most people in sports medicine, when stuff goes wrong for an athlete, when they see that athlete have fatigue or a decrease in mental focus or what we would call chronic inflammation. So inflammation that's been sustained for a long period of time, or like a persistent injury or illness, they often think, oh, this must be something having to do with their training load, or maybe it has something to do with their mobility, or something's wrong. As well as maybe they'll also look to like, oh, maybe it's improper equipment, or something's wrong with that, or we need to replace this or that, or potentially a lack of conditioning. And so this is the lens that most people look through when it comes to athletes and injuries and fatigue and just things that typically plague athletes for the most part. So, and the issue with that is that, okay, all of those things are really important to look at. And a lot of athlete issues can be solved by looking at those things, whether it's a training issue or mobility or issue with equipment or a lack of conditioning or something's wrong there. But when those are not the answer, that's when we need to be looking towards what's going on inside of the body, which is why we're talking about this today. And here's the mistake that a lot of people make in those situations, right? Is if you aren't looking at how the body's functioning internally, what you're going to do in those scenarios, if you think that it's a training issue, mobility issue, et cetera, what we have a tendency to do is maybe give a little bit of a break, but we'll add in more load, or we'll add in more training on the system, or we'll add in more exercise, or more like physical therapy exercises, right? Where we're trying to create an outcome. We're adding more into the system. But the thing is if the system is already overloaded, that's going to end up creating more of an issue, which is why sometimes athletes get that like persistent injury or persistent illness or something, that chronic inflammation type system, like that happens. And then no matter what they do or no matter what they try, they can't find the solution. And part of it is because there's something going on in the body that it's overloaded with stress. And in order to be able to clear that out, we actually have to look at what the mitochondria need and what else is happening inside the system. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So to kind of go a little bit deeper, so what are the mitochondria? They are your energy producing organelles in your cells. So when you have, like, if you just picture one cell, there are a lot of different things inside of that cell that are creating life for that cell. And they're using all sorts of different things in order to do that. Lots of vitamins, minerals. As I mentioned, like your mitochondria use the breakdown of your protein, fats, and carbs that come in from your system or from your diet. And then that's what they use to create energy. There are a lot of different things happening inside of that cell. And one of them is these mitochondria. And they do produce energy. They create adenosine triphosphate or ATP. And that's what you experience as energy. There's been something super interesting too. There's another research article that I wanted to cover today that was looking at the tight connection between mitochondria and physical activity. And it's interesting because basically what they were looking at is how the mitochondria function, and they are really important in very high demanding activities like endurance sports. So, and the other thing that's really critical to also keep in mind about the mitochondria is that you can create new mitochondria. So you can go through agenesis, or basically what you're doing is you're creating new mitochondria, and you can kill off your old ones and bring on new ones. It takes like 6 months to do it, but you can, especially if you have symptoms of like the mitochondria are not doing well, you can go through a process of regenerating your mitochondria, which I think is a really, really interesting and a very cool thing that people don't generally talk about a whole lot. But your mitochondria also play a role with your metabolism. They also play a role in cell death as well as inflammation. So your mitochondria are really crucial for you being able to adapt to exercise. So, and keeping that in mind, it really is important to like remember that when we're looking at an athlete that is dealing with something like fatigue or chronic pain or chronic inflammation or chronic injuries or illnesses. The other thing that's also really important to keep in mind as well in this scenario is that your mitochondria influence basically how your body has like its exercise capacity, right? So, and part of this has to do with how you use oxygen, how you regulate glucose and use sugar as an energy source, and then also what your body's resistance is to stress. One of the things that's really critical to talk about when we're talking about the mitochondria, and I know that there's a lot of words here, big words here, but part of what we want to just think about is when I'm talking about stress or load on the system, one of the things we're talking about is reactive oxygen species or oxidative stress. It's whenever you get exposed to any sort of like pathogen, any sort of pollution, toxin, anything like that, what's happening inside your body is you're getting exposed to these things called reactive oxygen species. What your body is supposed to be able to do is turn those reactive oxygen species into something that's less toxic by using antioxidants, right? Do you get it now? So antioxidants are basically trying to reduce the toxicity of reactive oxygen species. And that's why getting a lot of different types of colorful foods like fruits and vegetables and getting antioxidants from those foods is really critical because it helps to neutralize these reactive oxygen species in the body. Now, what's really interesting about training and about exercise is that we can increase inflammation and we can increase stress on the system, which can then add to that oxidative stress or that load on a person and on an athlete. And part of what can impact this as well is that acute and intense exercise can really have an impact on how your mitochondria function. And they also respond to things like pathogens and stress and traumas. So here's a really good example of somebody that I worked with in my office. So we were, she wasn't making really any progress as far as like seeing any benefits from her performance side of things. Like she trains a lot, in perspective, I think, of somebody who has kids and also works and has a full-time job and all of that. And she just wasn't seeing any progress as far as like getting faster, getting stronger. She also was struggling to lose weight. And I think that was one thing that was also kind of important to her, is that she just didn't feel like she looked like somebody that trained as much as she did, which I can totally relate to and totally understand. And one of the things that we found when we looked at this on a lab is that her oxidative stress and inflammation was really high. And this is a very important piece to think about, because as we're going to talk about here in this next section of this episode, is that endurance sports, if they are not balanced out well with diet and nutrition and antioxidants coming in through food, there is a certain point where the body will reach its capacity of oxidative stress. And then that's when you'll see that fatigue come into play, or that just like major decline in performance, or a plateau and then a decline. There is a process that happens in how your body adapts to exercise, where it will adapt and adapt and adapt, and then it will plateau because the oxidative stress and the inflammation, your body isn't able to mop that up anymore. So this is a really critical piece of how we work with athletes and make sure that you are able to get to race day feeling really healthy and strong and fit versus feeling fit and fatigued. So in this research study, what they were doing is they were looking at a comparison of the mitochondria between American football players and endurance athletes. And there were a couple of things that they found. I'm going to kind of summarize this because there were a couple of things that we just don't really need to talk about today, but there were a few things that they found based on the trauma and stress. So more physical trauma from American football, and then more training load and training stress from endurance athletes that had a very similar outcome on the body, and they were all influenced by the mitochondria. So one of the things that they found was that in American football players, they found that there was an increase in blood pressure and hypertension because during their football games, they are very prone to that trauma, right? That musculoskeletal trauma, which is, I mean, it's a contact sport, right? Like, I don't know if I need to explain that too much, but everybody knows that there's a lot of contact in football, and it was leading to a activation of certain things in the mitochondria, which then translated into issues with what we call the endothelial lining, which are part of what makes your arteries and veins. It's like it's the skin or the tube that makes your arteries and veins. What they were finding is that because of this increase in blood pressure, it was causing issues with the cardiovascular system and increasing something called hypertension. Hypertension, as some of you may know, is where the cardiovascular system, arteries and veins can start to calcify and harden, because blood pressure has increased so much that they should be very elastic, but the arteries are experiencing, a lot of pressure going through. And so then they start to calcify, which is a very interesting process. And what's interesting is that they were finding that there was a role that the mitochondria played in that process. On the flip side, one of the things that they were also finding for COVID, and the reason why it was being so difficult for some people, is that, especially with their cardiovascular system, is that COVID has something to do with how your mitochondria function. And one of the things that they found was that it was getting into the mitochondria in that endothelial lining, like I was talking about, in the cardiovascular system. And that was what was leading to that inflammatory cascade that was becoming such a big issue at the beginning of when we first saw the virus start, which is, again, why these things are really important, is because, like, if your mitochondria if they don't have what they need, we see a slew of different problems happen. And one of those is inflammation. So how this relates, not trying to get down too much of a rabbit hole there, is that when they were looking at this and what was happening from the trauma side of football players, they then were looking at what was happening for endurance athletes. And here's another thing that's really interesting. So I've looked at several different micronutrient panels, so vitamins, minerals, from football players and endurance sports athletes, and they almost look the same, because they're very different sports, but they have so many requirements as far as like nutrition goes. And endurance sports are almost as inflammatory as playing football, in a sense, which I thought was it's a very interesting thing to be able to, and it's different. I've seen labs from many other different types of athletes as well, but there's something very interesting about looking at, pro football players and endurance athletes. And part of it is because endurance sports are it's a very high inflammatory endeavor. But the reason I say it, though, and the reason why this is so important to talk about, is because there's so many things that you can be doing to combat that, but we're not talking about it. So that's why we're talking about it today. The other thing that is really interesting as well is that skeletal muscle damage, whether that's coming from a very intense training session or a very long endurance training session, or whether that's coming from trauma from like a contact sport or football, is that it depends a lot on metabolic and other types of factors going on inside the cell that are really caused by that intense and strenuous exercise. So one of the things that they found is that prolonged exertion from ultra endurance events and marathon running and triathlons and those endurance sports has been basically linked with that same cardiovascular alteration, that same hypertension process that they were seeing in the trauma from contact sports. So I mention it because the other thing that they also found as well is that, and one of the things I think that's really critical when you look at mitochondria, is that in your muscles, you have a lot of mitochondria there. You also have a ton of them in your liver and in your heart. So you're generally speaking not going to see, especially if an athlete is dealing with a mitochondrial issue, you're not going to necessarily see that show up as like a dysfunction in the muscle or the heart or the liver. What you're going to see is you're going to see something going on with the nervous system. And so that could look like migraines, that could look like ocular issues. So it changes within the eye, and anything that's kind of going on with the brain or the nervous system. That's headaches, stuff like that. That's in that fatigue that you feel, that overall like body, just like energy drain, brain fog, anything that's kind of going on with the nervous system. You want to look at the mitochondria first, because there's not that many mitochondria per cell in the nervous system. So if there is an issue there with the mitochondria, it's likely you're going to see it in the nervous system. So brain, nerves, things like that. So we're going to talk about what you can do to keep your mitochondria happy right after this short break. So a really critical piece about keeping your mitochondria really healthy and happy is, first off, understanding that in endurance sports, your body needs a lot of things coming in from food, from diet, from kind of lifestyle. You need to be managing, making sure that you're getting in enough food. But then also on top of that, we need to make sure that your recovery practices are on point as well. And we're doing things to help mitigate some of that oxidative stress or that load on your system. So there's a few things that you can do to make sure that you're again balancing out that load on your body. So number one is making sure that you have a happy gut, GI tract. Making sure that your gut is happy is really important, because they're part of what your gut absorbs: your vitamins, your minerals, all of those protein, fats, carbs. We want to make sure that your gut is super happy and healthy, because then that means that you'll be able to absorb those nutrients really well for your body to be able to then use. The other thing is that we've also seen that gut bacteria can also influence how your mitochondria are functioning as well. So there's a lot of reasons that we want to make sure that you have a very happy and healthy GI tract. So if you have any symptoms of bloating, of cramping, of GI related issues, if you have any other signs that the GI tract may not be doing so well, could be certain types of allergies, could be certain types of skin issues, like we've seen rosacea or psoriasis or things like that can often come from the GI tract. And then as well as things like brain fog, that kind of chronic inflammation or just issues with the immune system. A lot of those things have to do with the GI tract. The other thing that we also want to make sure of as well is that you are tracking how you're sleeping. You want to make sure that you're also looking at things like your resting heart rate and heart rate variability and tracking those, because those are very critical in showing you if your body is getting to that point where things are starting to like your performance is starting to stagnate. Maybe you are getting a little bit on that side of like starting to notice some fatigue. Things are just kind of things are not right. Like one week, things are going really, really, really well. And then the next week, things are really off. That can be just a sign that your body has sort of gone a little too far. And we're not able to mop up that inflammation anymore. We're not able to counteract that load, that stress on the system with what's coming in from our food and from our diet. And your heart rate variability and changes in that and your resting heart rate are one of the ways that you can see that coming and do something about it before it becomes a larger problem. The other thing that you can do as well is we also want to make sure that you have enough vitamins and minerals coming in from food to lower oxidative stress and inflammation, as well to support the mitochondria. We can get a large portion of these from supplements as well. I think one of the things that's really critical, though, to mention is that you can over supplement and you can decrease your ability to adapt to exercise and from all the training that you're doing if you're getting those in through like supplements. So here's two things to just keep in mind. Number one is a multivitamin is all your body really needs to fill in some of those gaps and keep your mitochondria healthy. But we want to use those in the parts of the year where we're not trying to get major adaptations to exercise. So here's maybe a good way to think about that. Let's say for the triathlon year, your training season is from like January to April or May, because that's when your competition season starts, is around April, May. You're doing the majority of your training and the majority of your work January to April or May, right? We're trying to get as strong as we can, as fast as we can. We're trying to build that base and build on that base in that time frame. And then the rest of the year is just kind of making sure that we're not, or the rest of that competition season is making sure that we're not losing any of that necessarily, right? So around probably your race season, whether that's April, May, June-ish, that's probably when you can start incorporating that multivitamin in again. But in that training season, we don't want to be taking any sort of supplemental vitamin or mineral. And that is because there's several studies, many of them, that have looked at a lot of the different types of antioxidants and vitamin C, vitamin E, all of those things. They've found that they will reduce or hinder your adaptation to exercise. So getting stronger, getting faster, they delay that, which is why we want to be very careful about what we do when we do it and what we take. So the final note on that is that you can take a multivitamin during that competition season as well as post-season and off-season to keep your mitochondria healthy, fill in some of those gaps that may have been caused, along the way. But in that in training season, we really want to focus on making sure we're getting everything that we need through food as much as you possibly can. So what does that mean? That means making sure that you're eating the rainbow of different types of vegetables and fruits, as well as getting some really, really good quality protein. The mitochondria love protein, so that's a really important piece. And then it can be just making sure that you have enough magnesium, making sure you have enough CoQ10. Those two are really critical for your mitochondria to be able to go through all of the different steps and use your protein, carbs, and fats efficiently and turn them into energy. So sometimes what that might look like is, instead of necessarily doing like a supplemental powder magnesium, one of the things you can do is put like a magnesium gel on the skin, and it bypasses the absorption in the gut and can be a very efficient and effective way, as well as, and we absorb it really quickly through the skin. Another thing you can do too is Epsom salt baths, and those can boost your magnesium as well. There's lots of different things there, but that you can do as far as like magnesium, as well as lots and lots and lots of different types of foods have magnesium in as well. But if you're having issues with being able to bring enough of it in via the gut, you can bypass that by getting it through the skin. So those are just a couple of things that you can do to support your mitochondria, but a lot of it really comes down to making sure that you're eating enough food, you're eating enough variety of different types of foods, and also making sure that your GI tract is really happy and healthy so that you can be able to absorb those as best as you possibly can. The last thing that you can do as well is you can actually test for this. I think what I'll do for this episode is I will post a video on some of my social media channels of what that looks like, what your mitochondria, how we can test your mitochondria. So you can look out for that. But one of the things that you can do is you can look at step by step how the mitochondria generate energy and go through that process of making ATP. And we can make sure that your body actually has all of the different types of vitamins and minerals to go through every single step of that. And the piece where this becomes so important is if somebody's having issues, right, with fatigue, with, chronic inflammation, or just things that are affecting their overall performance. We can test for all of this and see, how your body's actually doing, and is it being able to efficiently use your your fuel sources and is it able to actually generate ATP efficiently? And that's what's really important. So I hope that you found this episode helpful. I think it's just a very different way to look at things that typically can be problematic for athletes, but we only have a tendency really to look at it through one lens. And I hope that this has sort of opened up some other options to either treat athletes if you're somebody that works with them, or it's just another way for you to keep in the back of your mind in case something pops up and you're not being able to find answers via the normal ways, like going to your PT or talking with your coach or, whatever it is. There may be something else going on that may be going on internally that is not as easy to see. So that's our episode for now. Thank you so much for listening, and make sure to follow Wisp Sports on all social media channels. And it would be great if you would share this with anyone you think may love it. You can also follow me at Dr. Kirstin on Facebook and Instagram, and also at drkirstin.com. If you'd like to reach us with any comments or questions about the episode, you can by emailing us at info@wispsports.com. And you can always leave a direct message with us over on social media as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be back next week. Take care.